Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at how to play the Grand Prix attack in the Sicilian defense. Now, the Grand Prix attack is a very useful opening that you can use. It's a very attacking opening, and it actually does require a lot of memory to actually know what you should play at every specific moment. But other than that, it's a pretty good opening to play, and I definitely recommend playing it. So, it starts by white playing the move e4, and black will play c5. And instead of playing normal moves like knight f3 and maybe d4, going for Smith-Morra gambit, white will actually play the move knight c3. And at first this looks like the closed Sicilian, but after knight to c6, which is the main move, or e6 or d6, white is going to be playing the move f4. And I'm first going to be looking at the move d6 out of all of these. After d6 is played, white will play f4, and now black will play g6. So getting ready to fianchetto his bishop, white will play knight f3, black will play bishop g7, and white will play bishop to b5 check. So delivering a check, and of course if you play the move knight c6, then white is always ready to play the move bishop takes c6 and double black's pawns. So black will play bishop d7. You could have also thought about playing the move knight d7, but bishop d7 is a bit more common. But after bishop d7 is played, the very surprising move that white is going to play, bishop c4. And I know, this might seem like the strangest move to you. White just gave a check, and instead of trading the bishops off, he plays bishop to c4. Why is that? Well, it turns out that actually this bishop is worsely placed on the d7 square than it is on c8. Why? Because the bishop is not really helping black push the d5 pawn. And d5 is the main break that you want to get in the Sicilian, so black not being able to play it as soon as possible is a bit of a problem, mainly because this bishop is on d7. Had the move knight c6 been played, getting ready to push e6 and then d5, that could have been a little bit better, but after bishop d7, white plays bishop c4, and even though he gives up a tempo, whereas black does not give up a tempo, black is still worse because of his inability to push the d5 pawn. But anyway, the theory continues: knight c6, castles, e6, d3, and after black develops all of his pieces and castles, white plays the queen to h4. And after this queen h4 move is played, usually white is assumed to get a lot of attacking chances, and he should be able to push his pawns toward the black king, and it'll be a lot easier for white to get an attack compared to black. Now, instead of playing the move d6, you could have also went for e6. But if you go e6, then white will play f4, and black will play d5. White will play knight f3, and after a trade on the e4 square, white will not actually capture the pawn on e4 immediately. Instead, he'll first play bishop b5 check, and after bishop d7, he takes on d7 check. Now, why is white now capturing on d7? Well, first of all, his knight is under attack, and secondly, it's because black already managed to push the pawn to d5, so now capturing the bishop on d7 is no big deal. So knight takes d7 and knight takes e4, regaining the pawn, and after knight gf6, white will play d3 and he should have a good position. If black ever takes the knight on e4, then d takes e4 and white's central pawns can really be put to good use later on. So that was e6 and d6. Now what about playing the move knight to c6? This is the main move, and this is the main focus of what we're going to look at. And here, white will play f4, and black has a couple of moves he can consider. First of all, he can play the move g6. You could also play the move d6, and finally e6. Now, if you play e6 as black, then white will go knight f3, black will play d5, and white will play bishop b5, pinning the knight. And now black will play knight g7, trying to defend the knight. Obviously, this is also trying to guard and avoid any terrible pawn structures that white could try to use on black. So e takes d5, e takes d5, and now white plays the move queen e2. And this forces black's next move. Black should play the move queen d6. You may be thinking, why should black play queen d6? Well, it's because if you play another move such as g6, just developing, then white is happy to just play bishop takes c6 check. And we notice that this knight is pinned to the king, so there's no real defense against the c6 knight. Therefore, you would have to capture the bishop on c6, and if you look at the structure that black has compared to what white has, this is not going to end well for black, positionally speaking. So, black will play queen d6. And now after bishop c6 check, queen takes c6, d4. And after this d4 move is played, it is assumed that white is going to get lots of control over a lot of central squares. In this case, mainly d5 is one of them, but also the d4 square. And black is going to have to play a bit carefully, maybe just to avoid all of the control that this f3 knight can use on the e5 square. So it's an okay position for both sides. Now, instead of playing the move e6, black could also go for d6. And if d6 is played, then white will play knight f3. And here, black has two moves, a6 and e6. If e6 is played, then white is going to play bishop b5. Black will play bishop d7 and d3 by white. So, getting ready to castle, bring the bishop out, and etc. Bishop e7, castles by white, and knight f6. Just normal development. Bishop c6, and bishop d2. You should know that the light squared bishop for white isn't actually a very useful piece in this variation, so you're often going to see the move bishop takes c6 played by white. Castles by black, queen to e2, and b5. Black is trying to get his own counterplay on the queen side, whereas white is trying to focus more on the king side. White will play rook ae1, black will go b4, and now white will play knight d1. Potentially trying to maneuver the knight to either e3 or f2. Even if the knight goes to e3, another square from there could be also c4. So white's knight has a lot of potential from the d1 square going to e3 or f2. Queen c7, just developing the queen. Knight to e3 and a5. So after f5 is played, black's plan is to get a queenside attack, white's plan is to get a kingside attack, and basically they're just playing on opposite ends of the board. Now instead of playing the move e6 by black, black could also try a6. And if a6 is played, then white will just play g3, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop. And the main reason why white is playing g3 is because after a6 is played, there is no way of playing the move bishop to b5. So you cannot exchange your bishop for the c6 knight. Therefore, you must fianchetto the bishop, and therefore you also must play with the bishop on the g2 square. e6, bishop d2, bishop to e7, d3, knight f6, and here both sides castle and h3. So white is again trying to play the move g4 and follow up with an attack, and black will play b5, white g4, and after b4, knight e2, bishop b7, and knight g3. Usually it is assumed both the knight on g3 and the knight on f5 are going to help with the advancements of both the f5 pawn and the g5 pawn, and this also means that an attack can follow suit very quickly. Now, instead of playing the move d6, black could also try g6. And after g6 is played, white will play knight f3, black will play bishop g7, white will play bishop b5, and here black has two moves to try from, either knight d4 or d6. If d6 is played, then white will just castle, bishop d7 by black, d3 by white, knight f6, queen e1, castles by black is one move, and another move is a6. And if a6 is played, then white will trade his bishop off for the knight and play bishop d2, queen d7, rook b1. Now, you could also have just castled as black, and if you do this, then white will still play bishop c6 and queen h4 now, and here black will play b5. After b5 is played, white is just going to continue with his attack, f5, and now b4, knight to e2, and here this is where things get very tactical. Black can play either g takes f5 or e6. If e6 is played, then white will play bishop to h6, and after e takes f5, knight to g5. And this trick will be used quite a lot, and here black will play rook e8, and white will play knight to g3. And the idea behind this move is that you are trying to gain control of the f5 square, and obviously you're threatening the f5 pawn. Now, there's not really a lot of ways to defend the pawn, so black eventually has to give up, and he must play f takes e4. But this move just allows too much initiative from white's end. So white will play bishop g7, and after black plays king takes g7, I encourage you to pause the video and find a very brilliant move that white can play. Okay, so white can actually play the move Rook takes f6, and this entire idea behind Rook takes f6 is tied towards the weak kingside, mainly the h7 pawn, the f7 pawn, and the very vulnerable king on g7. Now, obviously, if you don't capture the rook, then you're down a piece, and it doesn't matter how you capture the rook, you're very much lost. If you play the move king takes f6, then white is free to just play the move rook f1 check, and black's king is in the center, and there's essentially no way of saving it. You can try king e5 or king e7, but in either case, white will play knight f7 check, and you're winning the queen on d8. If you try the king back to g7, then there's just checkmate to follow, so this can't work. That is why after this move, king takes f6 is played, black is essentially hopeless, and that is also why you should instead play queen takes f6. Now after queen takes f6 is played, white will start crashing through on the king, so now king f8 and rook f1. And the nice thing about rook f1 is that black cannot remove one of the attackers because he allows another one to infiltrate. And this is checkmate if black allows this. So black, completely helpless, will actually just play queen d4 check, and white will play king h1, sidestepping all the attacks. And here, king to e7. If black doesn't do anything, then his king is going to be caught, so you must play king e7, and rook takes f7 check by white. King d8 by black. And here, white will actually play a very brilliant move. So I encourage you to pause the video and find out what this move is. Okay, so white will actually play the move rook to b7. And this move is so cool because it's not only threatening mate on c7, but it's also threatening the move knight f7. And both threats combined together are just very deadly. Now, obviously, at this very moment, if you don't guard anything, then queen c7 is going to be checkmate. And if you try to guard the c7 square with rook c8, and this is really the only way you can do it, then knight f7 is checkmate. So that's not playable, but if you try the move bishop takes b7, then after queen takes b7, black is essentially lost. There is no way to defend against any threat, so what black must do is he must give up a lot of material. You can try playing the move queen f6, but after this, white will just play knight f7 check, and he's winning. You must take the knight, and after queen takes f7, you could try e takes d3 as black, but after c takes d3, rook e1 check, knight f1, black is hopeless. White will just play king g1 and king f2, and there's no way for black to really threaten any back rank attacks. So black is hopeless, and white is definitely way better. So that is why after the move queen takes b7, everything is lost for black. So instead, you don't have to play the move e6. Instead, you could play g takes f5, but this does speed up the attack at least twice as faster. Bishop h6 is played, f takes e4, knight g5, and now e6. Black is really hopeless. The main threat of bishop g7 and then rook f6 is a very common motif that you'll see in this opening, and it's just very hard to really defend against it if you are playing the black pieces. So e6 by black, bishop g7, king g7, rook f6, and here, if you play queen takes f6, then queen h7 is just directly checkmate, so king takes f6. But after rook f1 check, black is still completely lost. There's really nothing else to do. You can try the move king to g6 here as black, but that will just lose. After queen takes h7 check, king takes g5, and after h4 check, your king is just very vulnerable, and eventually it's going to get caught. Now after rook f1 check, there are a few other moves that you could play, but they all lose as well. You could try king to e7, but that would just lose to knight f7 check, followed by picking up the queen. And you could have also tried the move king to e5, but that loses to queen to f4 check, king to d5, and queen takes e4 checkmate. So there's really no way to run away from white, and that is why this variation is just very hard to defend against. King g7 would lose to queen takes h7 mate, and in actuality, there's barely any way that black is actually going to get a good position in this variation. So after all of this, we I've established why d6 is not really the best. So black will play knight d4. And after white castles, black has 3 moves to consider. You can capture the bishop, you can play the move e6, or you could play a6. E6 is the biggest sideline, and that is after e6 is played, d3 by white, knight e7. White will trade the knights on d4, bring his knight back. And after castles, bishop a4, white's plan is to just transfer the seemingly bad bishop in many variations into a useful one by bringing the bishop to b3 and trying to force this f5 move through. So that is e6, and if you try the move a6 by black, then after bishop c4, this is where it becomes a bit complicated. You can play e6 or b5 as black. If you try e6, then after d3, knight e7, knight d4, cd4, knight e2, d5, bishop to b3, de4, de4, castles, and after e5, knight c6 will be played, queen d3, queen b6, and after all of this, rook d1, rook d8, and bishop d2. White should get a good amount of development, and also black can never really try playing a5 and getting counterplay this way, because white can always play a4. And white's pieces are way better than black's. He can play king h1, a prophylactic move, and then bring his knight into a very active square like d6. And I would say that white is a lot better. You could also try the move b5, but that would allow bishop d5, rook b8, d3, e6, bishop b3, and after knight e7, a trade on the d4 square, knight e2, castles, and queen e1. Signaling that an attack is about to happen. d6, bishop to d2, bishop to b7, and now a4. Trying to loosen up the queen side. And after a couple of more moves, white's attack starts to proceed. So that is what happens if you play e6 and a6. Now, you could play the move knight takes b5, but white will just capture the knight. And after this, black again has a couple of moves he can play, which is either d5 or d6. If you play d6, then after d3, knight f6, knight c3, castles, queen e1, rook b8, queen h4, white is again getting ready for an attack, and by this time you've all guessed what is going to happen. White is going to capture on g7 and then capture on f6, and with this attack happening, it's really hard for black to defend against it. So that is why d6 is really not advised, but d5 is also an interesting variation that we'll see. And after d5 is played, e takes d5, and here you cannot capture the pawn on d5 because you'd lose the queen to a fork on c7. So a6, first chasing the knight away, knight c3, and now knight f6. Getting ready to capture on d5, d4, dc5, knight c3, queen d8, king d8, bc3, bishop c3, rook b1, and now king c7. An interesting variation to consider if you're playing the white pieces. Rook b3, bishop f6, and bishop d2. Threatening the move bishop to a5, and it's also a reason why you need to be very careful in variations like this. Black does get the ability to develop in this variation, but after a few more moves, we can see that black is actually a bit worse. This is mainly considered because of black's vulnerability of his king, and how white is really controlling it from escaping. And you can see that in the course of a few moves, black's rook on a8 gets locked out of the game, and after a couple of more moves, we can see that so does the bishop. And after the c5 move is played, white is just going to march his king up. You can also try just rook d8 and lock the bishop out forever. And eventually, the king is not going to be able to move, and neither will the bishop on c8. So this would allow the pawns to have to move. But after all of the pawns are done moving, you block all of them up. You don't allow them to move. Then that is when white is just going to play this rook to d8, and after the bishop goes back, white is just going to win quite easily, mainly due to the cramped position of black's pieces. So after c5 is played, that is the end of the variation, and I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.